Welcome to the NC Everything Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is the bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. Thank you all for joining me today for this episode. It's actually been a real struggle to put together. I tried to record a couple days ago, and as soon as I got everything set up, a bunch of dark clouds rolled in. I just knew it was going to thunderstorm, so I packed up everything, went back in the house. Ultimately, it didn't do anything, which doesn't surprise me. It's been threatening to rain on and off for a month, and most of the time it doesn't rain. It's just a tease. So anyway, yesterday I was going to record, and it was kind of cloudy, but I just knew it wasn't going to rain because it hadn't rained. So I come out here and set all my stuff up, and I started recording, and the bottom fell out, and it soaked me. The thing was, I got really mad because now it's finally raining. I'm trying to record. So I got really mad. I decided I was going to record in the rain. And I recorded as long as I could, and it ultimately didn't work out. My papers got wet. My microphone quit working. I'll probably put some video of that failed recording at the end, but it was very frustrating. And so here I am Saturday morning. I'm going to try to get it done now. Anyway, let's move on to the links. I always say if you want more NC Everything, check out the links below. You'll find a link for the Facebook group where I try to post as much North Carolina content as I can when I have time. You'll also find a link to the YouTube channel, which you won't find that if you're watching on YouTube, but if you're listening on a podcast player, you'll see the link to the YouTube channel where you can put a face with the name. Then you'll find a link for Tasting NC, the YouTube show I do with my wife, where we taste everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. And finally, the last, I guess you can call it a link. I don't think it's actually a link. It's the contact. The NC Everything Podcast at gmail.com. I tack it on there every time. It's probably my favorite part of the show. And I love recording this show. I love doing the research, and I say this a lot, but my favorite part is hearing from the listeners. If you guys write in and say hello or anything, it makes me feel good to know you're actually out there. You're not just a number on my data area where I can see my number of listeners, And I don't mean to stumble over my words. I've been awake for like 30 minutes. So anyway, I do like hearing from you. Check out the links for more NC Everything content. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the episode. This episode actually has a link to the last episode, kind of. At the end of the last episode, I had wrapped it up by saying I was packing up and heading to Myrtle Beach for vacation. And I did go, and I had a good time. After that much-needed vacation, it was time to head home. And if any of you know me, you know that my ride home was never a straight line. And this time was no different. After we got our traditional Bagel Factory bagels and Birchin Lane coffee down there in Myrtle, we headed north toward Elizabethtown, North Carolina. And that's not to be confused with Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which I actually did a lot. I actually had to do this over because I said Elizabeth City. But no, it's Elizabethtown, North Carolina. We stopped at this little place called Melvin's Hamburgers and Hot Dogs for lunch. My wife had read about Melvin's, and she wanted to try it out. And I can tell you, we weren't disappointed at all. It was a pretty good place. But we decided to use that opportunity since we were going to a restaurant, a North Carolina restaurant she had read about. We decided to use the opportunity to film an episode of Tasting NC. So we rode over to Jones Lake State Park and ate our lunch in front of the camera. And that brings us to today's content, Jones Lake State Park. Jones Lake is in Bladen County, and it's a bay lake. I've covered the Bay Lakes a few times. I covered them in episode 46 on Carolina Bays, episode 114 on Lake Mattamuskeet, episode 123 on Pettigrew State Park. And so I won't spend a lot of time describing what a bay is, but the Carolina Bays are mysterious lakes. They're found mostly in North and South Carolina, and for the most part, there's no real explanation of how they were formed. There's a lot of theories ranging from space debris to climate anomalies. However, Jones Lake is different than the rest of the bays. It's been determined to be a thermokarst lake that's 1,000 years old. So thousands of years ago, North Carolina was a whole lot colder than it is now. Yes, it was affected by the ice ages. So as the ground thawed out, and then wind and erosion kind of altered the way the land was, it formed what we now call Jones Lake. And if you know anything about Carolina bays, a lot of them aren't fed by rivers or streams like most lakes. And Jones Lake is no different. It relies solely on rainwater. But the way the lake bottom sits below or lower than the earth around it. So it already creates a bowl. But then the dirt, the soil in the lake, it doesn't drain at all. So water just gets trapped there like a big mud hole. Now, don't take offense to that. I say it's like a big mud hole. It's beautiful out there. It is not a mud hole. I'll throw some pictures I took up on the screen, or I probably have by now. But it is, Jones Lake it's a really beautiful area. I love wetlands anyway, and this is a good one. So now let's get into the history of Jones Lake. The area that they call the Bay Lakes region in Bladen County was settled during colonial times. Now, originally, Jones Lake was called Woodward's Lake. It was named for Samuel Woodward, who was a justice of the peace in the mid-1700s. Eventually, the lake was named Jones Lake for Isaac Jones. Isaac Jones was the landowner in Bladen County, and he was the one that donated the land for the town to be built on that would become Elizabeth City. And that was 1773. Now, it wasn't long after that time, the North Carolina General Assembly, they blocked any further private claims on any of the lakes. So, if you were a landowner, that was fine, but you couldn't claim ownership of any of the Bay Lakes. But it wasn't long after they blocked all the private ownership of the lakes that the North Carolina legislature granted ownership of all lakes greater than 500 acres to Columbus, Cumberland, and Bladen counties. Now, for the next 100 years, settlers moved in around the area, and they used it for farmland because, and I've talked about this before, all this land around the Bay Lakes was really fertile. So it was a great place to farm, so farmers moved in. Elizabeth City was, and probably, I didn't look at the map, Elizabeth City was the only town around there, really, and there's not a whole lot out there. Now, I may be dead wrong. Again, I didn't look at the map to see what else was around there. There may be a huge city around Elizabeth City. I have no idea, so don't hate on me too hard. But it wasn't just farming around the lakes. That they harvested what they called naval stores. And a lot of you may have heard about that in elementary school, middle school. But the naval stores mostly come from the pine trees, but it was turpentine, pitch, and timber. And you use these ingredients called naval stores for shipbuilding. And, I mean, North Carolina had a huge shipbuilding industry anyway. We had a ton of pines down east. A lot of the eastern towns, they harvested these naval stores for shipbuilding. A lot of deforestation happened down east. But that was the big income for this area in Bladen County. Eventually, the Great Depression would hit, and everything would come to pretty much a screeching halt. So during the Great Depression, the government, they decided everybody was scrambling to try to figure out how to help people, put people to work, let people earn some money. So the North Carolina government, I've talked about this in a lot of episodes, during the Great Depression, their attention turned toward conservation. And so they started building public parks, state parks, recreational areas. So Jones Lake, what we know of it today, was created during the Depression. And what they would do is they would purchase the land from farmers around Jones Lake, and they would use that land to build the state park. They bought the land, the government bought the land that would become Jones Lake State Park for $4.51 per acre. Now, like in a lot of American history, and a lot of Southern American history, there is a dark cloud over it, and that is segregation. When Jones Lake State Park was created, segregation and Jim Crow laws, that was all in full effect. I mean, even the Civilian Conservation Corps who built these state parks, they weren't even allowed to camp together when the state parks were under construction. So they had Singletary Lake, which was 13 miles away from Jones Lake. And it came through the same program during the Depression. They built up Singletary Lake, but it was declared a whites-only lake. And they say Singletary Lake was nice. I didn't see Singletary Lake. It was on my list, but I decided to go to Jones instead. But they said Singletary Lake was a really nice lake. They said it had cabins and dining facilities and tennis courts. So in 1937, they planned to build an African-American state park. So after buying the land, getting it all cleared off, getting the state park ready to go, they built bathhouses. They put up some picnic shelters, picnic tables, some concession stands. Now, there was never any intention to add a big dining hall or tennis courts. They never had any intention of making it as nice as the whites only state park, but they threw a few amenities out there. And from 1936 to 1939, Resettlement Administration, they managed Jones Lake State Park. And they were the ones that built the pier. They brought in the sand. They built them a rec center. They were the ones really responsible for doing what they could to Jones Lake State Park. And on July 1st, 1939, Jones Lake State Park officially opened as the first blacks-only state park in North Carolina. And it did far better than they thought it would. People, they poured into Jones Lake. And so there were plans to double the number of amenities there. In the mid-1960s, it began the process of trying to integrate. Apparently, there was a big sign at Jones Lake that said Negroes only. That sign was removed around 1966. And eventually, all the state parks were desegregated. But this didn't really stop some of the harassment, abuse. You know, they say, a restraining order is just a piece of paper. You can say that everybody's welcome here, but that doesn't mean everybody is welcome here. Immediately following desegregation, Jones Lake took a sharp decline in attendance. And a lot of that was, now that the lakes were desegregated, a lot of the blacks were going to these nicer former whites-only lakes that had better amenities. I've never actually been to White Lake, but it says White Lake had dance halls, a restaurant, rides, and a hotel. And it talks about how clear White Lake is. And I've heard a lot of people talk about how clear White Lake is. I don't know if any of my pictures that I posted, you can see the color of the water at Jones Lake, but it's the tannin water. So it's like the color of tea. It's not dirty. The tannin is just the leaching of the organisms around there. The water is actually, it's clear. You can see through it, but it's stained water. Where White Lake, I guess, had crystal clear water. But at the end of the day, Jones Lake was the safer option, because even though they were desegregated, a lot of blacks would show up to Singletary Lake and White Lake, and then they would face harassment. People would yell at them. People would try to get them to leave. People would treat them like shit. And so if they wanted better amenities, they would go to these former white-only lakes. But if they wanted a safe place where people would leave them alone, Jones Lake was the place to go. And eventually, like with most things, you give it enough time, it did get better. Jones Lake, it got a whole lot better. Eventually, a lot of that harassment and mess, it did die down. Again, I've never been to White Lake, so I'm not sure what the black and white population is around White Lake. But I do know Jones Lake hasn't changed much at all since the 1960s. You look at some of the pictures at the visitor center there, and it pretty much looks the same. Now, when I went, it looked like it was mostly white people there that day, which is kind of ironic because I just talked about how much better the white-only lakes were. But overall, Jones Lake hasn't changed much at all. And it is a really cool place. Today, Jones Lake State Park consists of the 224-acre Jones Lake and the 315-acre Salters Lake, which is nearby. And if you want to visit Jones Lake State Park, you can find it at 4117 NC 242 North, Elizabethtown, North Carolina. And that's really all I have for today's episode. I know it wasn't a real long one, but I think it was an important one. Jones Lake, when we decided to leave Myrtle Beach, I was looking at the state parks on the way home. And again, Jones Lake, Singletary Lake, and Salters Lake, they were all on there. And Jones Lake just stuck out to me. It's not a big giant place, but it's a kind of a cool pit stop along the way. So if you ever get in the area, I would definitely recommend checking it out. Anyway, that's all I got for today. Like I said, I'm probably going to tack on some of my failed footage of me trying to record in the damn rain. But I hope you enjoyed the show. And if this is your first time listening, definitely go back and check out some other episodes. I have some I'm pretty proud of, and I have some I'm not too happy with, but I guess they all can't be gems. But anyway, thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you in a couple weeks. And now my clicker has stopped working, I guess because it's getting wet. So we're going to go without the clicker. Anyway, a brief description of what a Carolina Bay is. I'm going to be brief because I did cover it in so many other episodes. The Carolina Bays, they're mysterious lakes found both. Now, I covered the Carolina Bays in several episodes. I've kind of lost my paper with all the episode listings on there. But you can go back and listen to Carolina Bays, Pettigrew Lake State Park, Lake Mattamuskeet. I covered Carolina Bays and all those. Since I covered the Carolina Bays several times, I won't go into real big detail on what they are, but they are mysterious lakes that are found mostly in North Carolina and South Carolina, and nobody really knows where they came from.